He lived in silence for years. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that presses against the mind until it begins to fracture. They said he had once been a warrior or a poet, or perhaps both. No one could remember anymore. He no longer carried a name, only the shadow that followed him, thin and restless, stretching longer with every passing day. At dawn he would sit facing the eastern mountains, where light first touched the mist. And each morning, before the world awakened, he would watch the same thing happen. The light arriving, the shadow returning. He began to wonder if the shadow was not something cast by the body, but something the body was cast by. If he could burn it, he thought, maybe he could be free. In the monastery, there was a story the monks never told out loud, about a man who once set fire to his own reflection. They said the flames consumed nothing, yet the man was never seen again. He did not die. He simply vanished from the eyes of those who could not see light without shape. The monk had heard this story when he was young, and now, old and tired, he began to understand it. Every prayer he whispered sounded like an echo returning from within. Every thought carried the weight of something he was still holding on to. Until one night, sitting before a single candle, he saw his shadow tremble on the wall, alive, waiting, as if it too had been listening all along. The air was still. The flame wavered. And in that moment, the monk understood. Enlightenment was not in light, but in fire. Not in stillness, but in burning. He leaned forward and whispered, not to God, not to silence, but to himself. If the shadow is me, then let me burn. The wind moved. The flame bent sideways. And before the dawn returned, only ash remained, and the faint outline of a man who had finally stopped existing. No one remembered his real name. In the monastery records, he was simply written as the Quiet One. He came from the northern valleys, where men fought for land and belief, but he had long abandoned both. He wore no insignia, carried no weapon, and when asked about his past, he only smiled, as if memory were a language he no longer spoke. The monks said he arrived barefoot, his robe torn, his eyes unfocused, like a man who had seen something too large to describe. They gave him shelter, food, and a new name, Hoshin, the heart that reflects the stars. He never corrected them. He bowed in silence and began sweeping the temple floor, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. He slept on stone, ate in silence, prayed without words. The others sought enlightenment through meditation, scripture, repetition. But he sought something else, disappearance. He was not trying to reach heaven or to understand the way. He was trying to stop existing within himself. Some nights, the younger monks would watch him stand before the candle in the hall, unmoving, eyes fixed not on the flame, but on the shadow behind it. He studied it the way a swordsman studies his opponent. He once said to a novice, "When the flame flickers, the shadow dances. But when the flame dies, the shadow remains. Which of them is real?" The novice didn't answer. He never saw Hoshin speak again. Years passed. His hair grew long and gray. His posture curved inward, as though he carried the weight of something unseen. But those who looked closely swore they saw light behind his eyes, a strange calm, like someone standing in a storm and no longer feeling the wind. He was not a teacher. He had no disciples, no followers. And yet, every monk in the temple eventually found themselves imitating his silence, sweeping the floor slower, breathing softer, praying less. He never tried to lead them. He simply stopped resisting the world, and the world began to follow. Still, when he was alone, that same shadow remained on the wall, waiting for him to notice it. It stretched longer with the setting sun, curling like smoke across the stone. And every evening, as darkness swallowed the courtyard, Hoshin would whisper only one sentence to himself. The shadow follows, because I still move. He began to understand that enlightenment wasn't about becoming light. It was about burning the part of him that cast the darkness. And so, one night, when the wind rose and the flame trembled, he decided it was time. Part 1. The Shadow of the Self. He used to believe silence would purify him, that if he sat long enough, the noise would dissolve, and what remained would be truth. But silence is not empty. It echoes. The more he tried to listen, the more he heard himself breathing, thinking, remembering. The shadow was always there, sitting across from him, matching every gesture, every doubt. It never spoke, but its silence was heavier than words. At first, he tried to escape it, sitting with his back to the light or praying in complete darkness. But wherever he went, the shadow found a way to follow. He began to realize it wasn't chasing him. It was bound to him, like breath to life. He thought perhaps he could outwait it, that if he could stay still long enough, maybe the shadow would forget him. So he waited. Hours passed, days. The sun rose and fell. The candle burned and melted into itself. Still the shadow remained, patient as stone. He began to see it differently, not as an enemy, but as a reflection of what he refused to see. The part of him that wanted to survive, even after the body was gone. The shadow didn't need light to exist. It needed attachment. As long as he clung to something, his name, his memory, his faith, the shadow had shape. He started to wonder, if he let go of everything, would it still remain? He closed his eyes. The world shrank to the sound of his breathing, the faint drip of water from the roof. Thoughts came like whispers, memories of battle, laughter, hunger, faces he no longer recognized. Each one cast its own faint shade, its own flicker of darkness on the walls of his mind. He tried to burn them one by one, to strip away identity until nothing remained. But the more he tried to kill the shadow, the deeper it clung to him. He began to understand that destruction was still desire, and desire was the root of the shadow itself. So he stopped fighting. He sat. He waited. He let the thoughts drift past like smoke through an open window. For a moment, he felt the faintest peace, not because he was free, but because he'd stopped running. The shadow grew softer, less defined. It no longer mirrored him. It simply hovered, like a question without an answer. And in that trembling blur of darkness and light, he whispered, "If the shadow is the part of me that resists, then perhaps it is the only part still alive." Part 2. Fire of Awareness. He had always thought enlightenment would come gently, like dawn after a long night. But the truth did not arrive with light. It came with fire. It began with a sound, a tremor in the air, so small that at first he mistook it for breath. Then came the heat. The candle flame before him bent sideways, reaching toward the wall where his shadow waited. For years he had watched that darkness move in silence, faithful, obedient. But tonight it trembled, as if it too felt fear. Hoshin's eyes did not blink. The line between the flame and its reflection began to blur. Light and shadow folded into each other until he could no longer tell which was real. He remembered the story the monks whispered, the one about the man who burned his reflection and vanished. He had thought it a parable. Now he understood it was a memory. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with awareness. He reached out toward the flame. It flickered against his skin, but he did not pull back. Pain, warmth, sensation, all of it was illusion. The fire did not burn the flesh. It burned the distance between what he was and what he thought he was. Smoke rose, curling around his wrist like ink in water. The room grew dim, the air heavy with heat and silence. He saw the shadow writhe against the wall, struggling to keep its shape. Every movement of the flame tore a piece of it away. It screamed without sound, breaking apart into fragments of smoke that looked almost human. He whispered, "You are what I refuse to release." The words cut through the heat like a blade. The shadow froze, trembling. He realized then that the shadow had never been his enemy. It had been his teacher, the mirror of everything he would not face. For years it had followed him, not to torment, but to guide him toward this moment. The realization broke him open. He leaned closer to the flame until the light consumed his eyes. The room disappeared. The body disappeared. Only the fire remained, not as destruction, but as revelation. It burned without consuming, illuminated without heat. In that final flicker, he saw not a man and his shadow, but one continuous motion. The light learning to accept its own darkness. He smiled, and for the first time in his life, the shadow smiled back. Then both were gone. Part 3. Ashes and Light. When the fire was gone, there was no sound, no air moving, no body breathing, only the faint shimmer of heat dissolving into nothing. The walls of the temple were blackened, the floor covered in a thin layer of ash that glowed faintly in the morning light. But there was no smoke, no scent of burning. Only stillness, a stillness so pure it felt alive. In that silence, something began to stir, not in space, but in awareness itself. It was as if the mind had folded inward and found no one inside. No thought, no watcher, no weight, just light, soft, endless, unbroken. It filled the room the way water fills a cracked vessel, finding every space, every emptiness, and calling it whole. The monks found the chamber hours later. They saw the ashes, the candle, and the outline of a man drawn faintly on the wall, not in soot, but in light. They whispered his name, but no echo answered. They said perhaps he had reached nirvana, or perhaps he had died. But those who looked closer saw something else. The shadow on the wall was still there, but it no longer moved. It had become part of the light itself. It did not follow. It simply was. The abbot touched the ashes and felt no heat, only a strange calm, as if the fire had burned through illusion rather than matter. He told the others, the monk did not vanish. He became what was already here. For years afterward, no one entered that chamber again. They left it untouched, a space where silence had once spoken. And sometimes, in the blue hour before dawn, when the mist drifted through the temple halls, the young monks swore they saw a faint figure sweeping the floor. Barefoot, head bowed, as if time itself had remembered his movement. But when they looked again, the figure was gone. The light remained. The air shimmered softly, holding the warmth of a fire that had never truly burned. Outside, the sun rose behind the eastern mountains, just as it always had. And in that familiar glow, the world continued, unaware that something had ended and something infinite had begun. The story you have just heard is not a legend from any single faith. It is a woven echo of ideas that have appeared again and again across centuries, teachings that all point to the same invisible place where the self begins to disappear. The monk Hoshin never existed in history, but his silence belongs to the spirit of many who sought to see beyond the mind. His burning shadow is not an act of destruction. It is a metaphor drawn from Zen and early Buddhist philosophy, where the self is seen as a mirage, something created by attachment, sustained by thought, and dissolved through awareness. In Zen, enlightenment is often described not as the gaining of knowledge, but as the burning away of illusion. Hoshin's fire, therefore, is the inner flame of realization, the moment when one stops mistaking the reflection for reality. Yet the story also carries the breath of Taoist teaching, especially the writings of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, where the goal is not to control the world, but to flow with it. When Hoshin stops resisting his shadow, he embodies Wu Wei, effortless action, the harmony that arises when struggle ends. The shadow becomes his teacher, just as in Zhuangzi's parables, the butterfly and the dreamer exchange places, showing that self and world are not two things, but one. The imagery of fire and shadow comes from Tantric and Advaita traditions as well. In those teachings, fire represents consciousness, pure awareness that consumes all illusion but leaves the essence untouched. The burning of the shadow is the dissolution of identification, the end of I am this, and the beginning of simply I am. To burn one's shadow is to let go of all shapes the mind has drawn and to see light as it is, without form, without name. Even the structure of the story, silence, burning, and light, mirrors the three stages of inner practice found in many mystical paths. The first is purification, confronting the noise of the self. The second is illumination, the fire of awareness that destroys false identity. And the final is union, the quiet after the flame, where everything returns to stillness. Hoshin's journey is not meant to inspire imitation, but understanding. It is not a call to retreat from life, but to see through it. The shadow, the fire, the ash, these are not mystical symbols, but reflections of the same truth. That awareness is not found by seeking light, but by understanding the darkness that shapes it. In the end, nothing was destroyed. The fire did not take the body, and the silence did not swallow the world. What burned was the distance between what we think we are and what we truly are. That distance is the shadow, and all our lives, we move within it. But there comes a moment when even the shadow grows tired of following, and in that moment, we see it. The truth was never hidden behind the darkness. It was the light inside it. Every thought, every fear, every name we carry is only smoke rising from that single flame. And when the smoke clears, there is no monk, no story, no self, only the quiet that has been watching all along.